Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here for the Economist Impact Sustainability Week for a session on measuring ESG impact. My name is Arjun Ramani. I'm the Economist Global Business and Economics correspondent based out of London. And I'm very pleased to introduce Henning Stein as our guest today, who is the Global Head of Thought Leadership and Market Strategy at Invesco, a large investment management firm. Welcome, Henning.
Hello, Arjun.
Wonderful. So our theme for the event, as mentioned, is measuring ESG impact. So I wonder if I could start broad, Henning. Could you just provide a quick sense for us of what ESG impact is in the status quo, how it's measured, and what exactly these measures are used for?
Yeah. Maybe we should begin with why ESG actually impact is measured. So the fundamental idea, of course, is to show ESG investments, make a difference. And a key part of this is to really demonstrate the many millions of investors who want to serve the greater good, that there is actually something to achieve with that goal. And this is absolutely crucial, right? Because ESG investing could lose credibility if we can't prove it's really contributing to positive change. And as to the question of how ESG impact is measured, well, that's a much more complex issue, one that's becoming increasingly controversial. Right now, there's a variety of ratings, scorecards, other metrics that can be used to assess multiple dimensions of ESG performance. And data, I would say, is really the lifeblood of most of these, which means, it's largely a qualitative exercise to put this together and convert that into data. And there's also some scope for more subjective judgment, really. And ideally, we can use these measurements then to determine where the allocation of ESG funds is having an impact, whether positive or negative. In other words, we can tell which business or businesses are improving in ESG terms and whether investors' broader ESG goals are being met. And that's really the fundamental idea. But the reality isn't so clear cut, and that's why we need disruptive thinking around the issue of ESG impact.
Got it. No, that's a really helpful introduction. And so on that, just to kind of narrow in on what exactly these measures mean, what do you think about the current system? What exactly is it capturing? You mentioned, and when people talk about ESG, we have the environmental component, the social component, the government component. Are you confident that the current system is capturing something meaningful, or what would you like to I guess see change in that?
Well, the wider context is important here, and we need to remember ESG is still in its relative infancy and has only recently really entered the mainstream. And it's clear we are on a learning curve as far as measuring ESG impact is concerned. And it's also clear our current approaches aren't sufficient. So, in some ways, we can frame the problem as the difference between feeling good and doing good. And let me give you an example of what I mean. So, investors might feel good about divesting from a business whose policies, practices aren't ESG aware, but they're actually, question, are they doing good by doing this? And for instance, they wouldn't be doing good if those holdings were then simply bought by other investors. That would be a zero sum game at best. They would also lose the option to influence the business through proxy voting engagement, two very key vehicles for positive change. So anyone who argues, divesting is a sign of purity and means of fighting greenwashing, that it doesn't really understand how capital markets operate. So they also don't understand the success or otherwise of ESG investing should be gauged in terms of outcomes achieved, not efforts undertaken. And that's a problem right now. So too many ESG processes and metrics are geared more towards feeling good than towards actually doing good. And a related problem is an excessive focus on materiality. It's my personal view. It's not shared by everyone in the industry. This is especially the case with the ratings that underpin many ESG investment decisions. If you take, for example, the MSCI rating, the most widely used one, we see they are rooted in what MSCI calls the materiality metrics. And this looks very comprehensive at first sight, but it fails to cover really significant ESG consideration. You can take an example, animal welfare wouldn't be included, right? So Carl Icahn's proxy battle to stop a major fast food company currently from using gestation crates is, in the global supply chain that illustrate this point. And these crates are widely considered inhuman, but controversy doesn't have an effect on that MSCI ESG rating for that company. Why? Because MSCI takes the view that issues like these don't constitute either a risk or an opportunity for the business, for the bottom line. And there are also examples of assessing ESG impact by measuring irrelevancies, right? So the same fast food company illustrate that point too. If you look at the supply chains that produce more greenhouse gas emission than some countries in the world, and yet MSCI has given them a quite improvement in terms of their environmental rating. Why? Because that company is also using recycle bins in countries where they have to do that from a regulatory perspective. So in other words, it has been rewarded for reducing a minor risk to its bottom line, but not punished for posing a major threat more generally. And of course, we shouldn't forget that there are also many examples of ESG serving the greater good in a clearly measurable way. First question we should ask is whose objectives we want to measure, right? And the fact is that clarity begins with the client objective. And this is a key starting point for assessing really real world ESG outcomes, is determining really what the investor wants to achieve in the first place. And that's why conversations with clients should involve a lot of listening. And we need to understand, their financial, their non-financial goals. We always say, no two investors have exactly the same requirements, and that applies to ESG just as it applies to other objectives. In my experience, there are five, overarching approaches investors might consider when they look at ESG. An important point is that each of these goals um, have to be really determined in terms of metrics. And the first approach is ESG as a means of driving proxy voting and engagement. Two very, very powerful ways, potential vehicles for impact, in my opinion. And this approach can be impactful, but it requires obviously taking positions in advance, and it applies across the board. So it's not just for an ESG product, it really applies to all of the holdings and asset managers involved in. And the second is ESG as a tool for reducing portfolio risk, right? Very important. This relies on ratings, other data, as well as opinions of what then defines the risk. Again, this is an approach that can be applied really across the board. It's not an investment approach really confined exclusively to ESG. The third is ESG as a means of aligning values. And this is understandable from an emotional perspective, but not necessarily impactful. It can be a particular weak approach when you apply that to listed companies, and can be, a little bit prone to greenwashing, I would say. The fourth is then ESG as a thematic approach, right? You want to tap into an opportunity, get exposure to certain themes, for example, smart food, net zero technology, or diversity. And I would argue that certain long-term ESG aware themes are likely to represent some of the biggest growth opportunities in human history. And then the last one, the fifth one, is ESG as a vehicle for true impact. And here capital flows directly into activities that make a positive, a lasting difference. And now the reality is that many investors who are drawn into the idea of ESG, they start with a jumble of poorly understood motivations and goals. And that's why we have to establish clarity from a very outset in the conversation with the client. And it's why we need a truly client-led and investment-led approach. And bearing all these considerations in mind, I think we also need to make an important point here about the problem of greenwashing. That sounds as if there's a bad intention by someone to deceive someone else, but this is very rarely the case, right? In the asset management industry, we simply react to client demand and then build solutions that aim to respond to these needs. And that's what we mean by client-led. And now global asset managers such as Invesco has a very broad spectrum of clients, ranging from individuals to sovereign wealth funds, and their specific needs are also likely to vary from region to region. So Crucially, this includes both their financial and their non-financial goals. And so to return to my original point, ESG metrics need to really focus on client objectives and the fact that every client has different objectives.
And it's useful to have that 5-point framework you just brought up on kind of the various ways to maybe taxonomize those objectives. I guess just to kind of pin that down a bit more, what do you see as kind of the best example of this in practice? Either a rating system created by a fund or a set of investors that are kind of following this. What metrics are they using? I wonder if you could explain that. Provide what you think is a good example for us.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can highlight a specific fund or corporation, but one sector that could help show the way forward here is real estate, right? So my colleagues at Invesco Real Estate have many examples of our direct real estate capabilities delivering a quantifiable ESG impacts. And these include improved costs, more efficient use of energy, resources, and even enhanced health and well-being of tenants, right? And I think a key point here is that we can have a direct influence in real estate. A major reason for this is that we own the building, right? So in other words, direct real estate provides us with tangibles, and we know exactly what we consume, so we are able to reduce it. And we know a building's performance and the change we can expect from a certain level of investment. So we can measure improvements, and this means we can see the impacts of our actions have on the property itself, on the tenants, and the community more broadly. And but that kind of direct relationship and reporting isn't so easily achieved in other investment arenas, and that's a challenge we face.
Thank you, Henning, for providing that example. It does seem like real estate is one where it's easier to have a closer eye on what's going on. But I kind of wanted to ask about a broader theme here. So I recently read this Bloomberg article that showed that ESG funds have hit records of AUM, assets under management, in 2021, around 35 trillion globally. By 2025, that's set to hit 50 trillion. It's about one in every three managed dollars. And I wonder, given what we've just talked about, what is the impact of all this? Has this actually shifted capital to more, ESG friendly companies, or are we just kind of relabeling existing investments as ESG?
Right. Well, it's another major question around ESG impact, and how long are we prepared basically to wait for evidence that investments are making a difference? And on the one hand, because investing requires a long-term outlook, we might say we need to be more patient, and that time will tell. On the other hand, we might say there should be continued substantiation of ESG impact, as there is this financial objectives, right? And one thing we can say with certainty for now is there's clearly a willingness to change. A broader ESG shift is obviously underway, and in addition, we are seeing growing evidence of change, particularly in areas like venture capital. Think about private equity, real estate. But the fact remains that we need much more evidence, and we need to devise more dependable, more robust ways of acquiring it. So we have to really define investment outcomes that are aligned with client objectives and whose impact then can clearly be measured. And we at Invesco, we did some great work together with Elroy Dimson, Professor Elroy Dimson, Cambridge, Judge Business School, and we argued for more relevant, reliable, relatable ESG reporting. That means it has to be quantifiable, it has to be objective, consistent, and comparable. And we also need fund reporting that recognizes a one fits all, right, philosophy can't be applied when we're dealing with ESG investors. We also need to focus on measuring the things that really matter. And on the whole, we need fewer ESG metrics, I think, rather than more. And at this stage, as I said earlier, we still have far too many metrics that are too heavily centered on feeling good instead of doing good. And this will only encourage more sort of greenwashing, whether deliberate or not, right? Over time, we need uncomplicated standards and clear frameworks.
Got it. And on that topic, of greenwashing, I think there have been a couple of recent announcements, where regulators have, recently started to crack down on this. So one recent notable example, of course, is the SEC fined, BNY Mellon, a bank, for claiming that they incorporated ESG impacts for all the investments in certain mutual funds, but in fact, the probe found out they didn't. And this raises the broader question that I want to ask about, which is, what should there be a role for the government in this type of standard setting, and creating disclosure requirements, ensuring people are actually making ESG investments when they say they are? What do you think the government's role should be in all of this?
Yeah, the point to make here is that governments must have a role, right? Simply because of the scale and the significance of what's at stake. And ultimately, we can think of ESG investing in terms of addressing some of the greatest challenging we all face on the planet as inhabitants. For example, consider some of the ESG investment themes I mentioned briefly earlier: smart food, net zero technologies. I mean, this is about positive change, and it will affect billions of lives. So there must be a multi-stakeholder collaboration, including government. Obviously, legislators and regulators are already playing their part. For instance, they're helping provide broader ESG frameworks. A lot of work has been done here in the EU. But a major challenge is to ensure really legislation keeps pace with innovation in this space. And history suggests that this is difficult. Ideally, the role of government would be to work with the investment industry and other stakeholders to really determine meaningful standards. And those standards should help provide a level playing field for framing ESG impact, while at the same time allowing further innovation. And one of the problems to date has been that most of our non-financial metrics have been developed on the fly, right, as ESG has matured. And this is in stark contrast to the historical development, what you see in the financial metrics area, right, which really emerged from an organizing framework. And we will never achieve perfection, of course. There will always be room for improvement, but this doesn't mean ESG as a whole is on the wrong path. This is a question of really recognizing where we are on the learning curve and then undertaking a necessary process of making ESG better.
Got it. Yeah, thank you, Henning, for that. And I think in general, it seems like the track we're in is a little bit more positive than maybe the casual view might be of how this broader project of measuring ESG impact is going. So thank you for joining us today. I want to thank the audience for listening in, and we have many more events, so please stay tuned.
My pleasure. Thank you.